So welcome everyone. My name is Glenn Brand, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Director for Solar United Neighbors. And really appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar, how solar supporters can hold utilities accountable. Tonight's webinar will focus on how monopoly utilities play an outsized role, to put it mildly, in determining the rules and regulations around rooftop solar and other clean energy policies, a broad range of them, in fact. And also what we can do, what you can do to fight back and protect our energy rights. We are delighted to have three national leaders on this crucial subject. Author, professor, teacher, Dr. Leah Stokes, Chandra Farley of the Partnership for Southern Equity, and Energy and Policy Institute's David Pomerantz. The agenda for tonight will be as follows. Dr. Stokes will give an overview and history of the problem of monopoly utility overreach. Then David will discuss how utility money corrupts and influences public policy. And then Chandra Farley will talk about on-the-ground campaigns to hold utilities accountable. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. And we could always ask a question. If you can go to the next slide, please. You can always ask a question using the chat function, and you just click on that chat icon, and you can select who you want to send the message to, either all panelists and attendees to talk to everyone, or the default is all panelists, which would just go to the presenters. So use whichever you prefer. I'll wait for the slide to come back. There it is. If you have one, go back one more, please. Annie? Okay. If you have any technical difficulties, just use the chat function. So ask unless you're having a problem with the chat, and I don't know what we'll do then. Be aware that we'll share the recording and the materials and links we reference after the webinar. So you don't have to take notes. We'll share all of this. And let's get started. I'll introduce each of the presenters in turn. First, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Leah Stokes. Leah is an assistant professor of environmental politics at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She received her doctorate from MIT. She has written on energy and climate policies and politics for numerous media outlets, in addition to her scholarly work. And she co-hosts the A Matter of Degrees podcast, which I can personally recommend. Her most recent book is really a must-read on the topic of tonight's webinar. It's called Short-Circuiting Policy Interest Groups in the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. And that was published in by Oxford University Press last year. So welcome, Leah, and take it away.
Well, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. Thanks so much for having me, and great to be on this panel with David and Chandra. So great to be part of this webinar. So as Glenn just mentioned, I work on electric utilities and sort of the politics and policy around them. And as part of the book that I wrote, Short Circuiting Policy, I took a long dive into the history of electric utilities. And as many of you may know, there's lots of different electric utilities in this country. They come in different flavors, so to speak. We have investor-owned utilities, which are basically private utilities that typically operate as monopolies, where they get to charge rates to customers and make profits and pass on those profits to shareholders. And the way that those utilities are regulated was actually set up in the early 20th century as a grand bargain between state legislatures and utilities. Basically, these utilities had to figure out how can we expand our capacity, build new coal plants at that time or hydropower projects, and make electricity cheap enough so that we can actually keep expanding, because the fixed costs of their good are so high that they needed to make sure that they had enough customers that they'd be able to sell those kilowatt hours from those projects to enough people. And so the deal that they came up with was that they would get monopoly rights to operate in a given area, and in exchange they would be overseen by public utility commissions, sometimes called public service commissions or corporation commissions. They have different names in different states. But these bodies, which are so critical to the conversation that we're going to be talking about today, PUCs, exist in the vast majority of states, and they were set up in the early 20th century in exchange for these monopoly rights for utilities. Now, that's just one type of utility. Some of you may also be in areas with rural electric co-ops. Rural electric co-ops were established under the New Deal, and they set up a different kind of model that doesn't involve shareholders, but that basically has a cooperative model where there's a board, often made up of people who live in the community, and that's how they oversee the decision-making process. They're not overseen by public utility commissions. And of course, at some other areas, rather than going up to the state level for a utility, cities decided to retain control over the power system. And so in some places we have municipal utilities where they're overseen by the city council. You can think about this, for example, in Sacramento with SMUD. So, or in Austin, Texas with Austin Energy, a lot of different places, a lot of big cities have these municipal utilities. And just to add a little more complexity on top of that, we also have some federal authorities, right? Like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which oversees certain parts of the Southeast and is a different kind of utility. So my gosh, so many different utilities. But regardless of where you are, in the vast majority of places, they are monopolies. It doesn't really matter what kind of utility it is, they're generally monopolies. What does that mean? I'm sure you've experienced it. You don't get to choose who your utility provider is. They are assigned to you based on where you live, and that's who you pay money to. And this becomes particularly problematic when utilities start to engage in really problematic behaviors, like, for example, spreading climate denial, which they did throughout the 1990s. And David Pomerantz, through his organization, the Energy and Policy Institute, has published a really important report called Utilities New, which shows the history of climate denial and how much utilities were involved in funding groups like the Global Climate Coalition. And in my book, Short Circuiting Policy, I also unpack this. Now, not only were they doing these things, spreading climate denial, they have unfortunately over the last decade been pretty active in what we could call climate delay, or trying to slow down clean energy progress. And that's probably the thing that you're most interested in as part of this webinar. And it's also really the subject of my book. So what has happened is that particularly around 2011 through 2013, utilities realized that this bedrock policy that exists in the vast majority of states, in about 42 out of 50 states, called net metering or net energy metering, was not in their financial interests. How does net metering work? You probably know, but just a quick refresher. Net metering is the policy that allows you to put solar on your roof and to generate a bunch of electricity. You're going to use some of that electricity for your house, you know, your lights or whatever, but there'll be other times a day, maybe because it's not COVID and you're not working from home, where you're generating excess electricity and you're not using it in your house. And in that situation, what you're doing is you're becoming a provider to the grid, right? Your meter is in some sense spinning backwards. You're not just pulling kilowatt hours from the grid, you're now supplying kilowatt hours to your neighbors. And the net metering framework, which was passed largely without controversy in the vast majority of states throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, what it said was that if you're buying electricity at a given price, like let's say 10 cents a kilowatt hour, you're going to sell it at the exact same price. And so that's why it's net metering, right? So this is a really uncontroversial policy, but what happened was a lot of people started to adopt solar, and suddenly the utility industry, particularly through the Edison Electric Institute, including in a report that they published called Disruptive Challenges, began to realize that this was not in their financial interest. Because what happens is that when you put solar on your roof and you stop paying as much money to the electric utility, they still have a lot of fixed costs, right? Those same challenges that I was talking about in the early 20th century that utilities were facing, they still have today, right? They've got the poles and the power plants and all these people who work for their company, and those are a lot of fixed costs. And they have to spread those fixed costs on a unit basis through a cents per kilowatt hour charge, right? And so if people stop buying as much kilowatt hours, well, suddenly they don't have as much revenue, which means that they need to raise the cost, raise that price of electricity. And as they raise the price of the electricity, what happens? More people find that it's financially like break even or even profitable for them to go solar. And so what you have is this cycle where more people going solar begets maybe slightly higher prices, begets more people going solar, and so on and so forth. And while we might view that as a positive spiral of solar adoption, the industry viewed that as the death spiral. That was the literal term, right? That they were going to lose their customers and lose their way of making money. And so what they did is they started to attack these policies. And they didn't just attack net metering. They also, for example, in Arizona, one of the cases in my book, and also a case that I did where David Pomerantz was part of the podcast episode on A Matter of Degrees. It's called The Darth Vader of Electric Utilities. I definitely recommend people check that out because it's all about the same topic we're talking about today. You know, in Arizona, they didn't just try to get rid of net metering. They also got rid of incentives for solar commercial customers or residential customers. They also tried to put giant fixed fees on customers, which makes it less financially viable because let's say you're zeroing out your bill, you're not buying kilowatt hours from the electricity provider anymore. Well, you still have a little bit of a bill, right? Your fixed costs. And if you make those fixed costs bigger, that makes the finances of solar more difficult. So unfortunately, we've had this dynamic play out with a lot of utilities really attacking clean energy policies. And I'll just say one other thing before handing it back to Glenn, which is that now there's some states where things are even worse. And maybe you live in some of those states where indeed utilities never even allowed us to pass net metering in the first place or any kind of renewable portfolio standard or incentives or any kind of support for solar. And that leads to places like Florida, for example, very sunny place, being a place with only 15% clean electricity today, way below the national average of 40% clean power. And so, you know, the policy framework is so critical for clean power because it's not just like if you live in a sunny place that magically people will build solar. We have to get the finances right. We have to get the structure right. The last thing I will say is that in this spring, there's going to be a bill in Congress. This is what's happening right now. We're doing impeachment. You may have heard of that. Then we're going to do this COVID stimulus bill. And then the next thing that Congress is planning on doing is a big climate, clean energy and infrastructure bill. And so there may be opportunities to make sure that solar, for example, is incentivized. And one of the policies that I've been working on very actively is a clean electricity standard. So you may know that Biden ran on 100% clean power by 2035, and we're working really hard to try to get that passed into law in Congress this spring, and particularly targeting 80% clean power by 2030, which puts us directly on the pathway to 100% clean by 2035. So I feel like we're at a really critical moment right now when it comes to federal action that can help correct some of the nefarious tactics we've been seeing utilities engage in at the state level and make sure that we have incentives all across this country rather than just a patchwork of some states pulling ahead, others putting up barriers to action. We really do want to have a national framework, and there's going to be a critical opportunity to pass that this spring. So I would just really encourage people to try to get involved in this effort, whether that's, you know, writing to Congress, calling your senator, helping other people do that, working through organizations, because we're talking about a bill that's like the Waxman-Markey bill happening within the next few months, really big climate bill. So definitely get involved. And with that, I will hand it back to Glenn.
Well, thanks a lot, Leah. I've already written down a couple of questions to ask you, so we'll get to that pretty soon. That's really helpful to set the table. Thanks very much. Our next presenter is David Pomerantz, and he is the Executive Director of the Energy and Policy Institute. Under his direction, EPI, as they're known, has been producing really invaluable, essential research on the political and lobbying spending and behavior of monopoly utilities in the US. Before joining EPI, David worked for Greenpeace for a number of years and as a reporter for newspapers in Boston and New York City. Like Leah, David now lives in California, though he's a transplanted New Yorker. So David, thanks very much for presenting to us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I'm going to try to share my screen. I have just a couple of slides here. So let's see if this works. Are y'all able to see this? Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much to Solar United Neighbors for asking me to join this panel. It's a real honor to be with Leah and Chandra, both of whom are absolute forces of nature when it comes to standing up to utilities and on behalf of communities and people. So I'm very happy to be here. I am going to go through a couple of these slides just to talk a little bit about how utilities spend money on politics. And I'm not going to go into tons of detail on this, but I'm just going to introduce a few ways, some things probably folks are familiar with and some things maybe a little less so, and then happy to take your questions. So I'm going to talk about a few of these ways that utilities spend money. Most people are probably familiar with campaign contributions. I'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about how utilities spend what's often referred to as dark money, which has been in the news a lot in the last year or so, how they manipulate charitable spending to their advantage politically, their trade associations, and then just a little bit on how we can fight back against this stuff, because you know, this issue of sort of political corruption and money in politics, it can be you know, kind of depressing and somewhat gloomy, but we do have a lot of tools to be able to fight this stuff. So I want to talk at least a little bit about that. I'll probably spend the least time on this question of campaign contributions. I think most folks know, you know, we have a campaign finance system in the US, both at the state level and federally, that allows corporations to spend lots and lots of money on politics in ways that are virtually unlimited. So, you know, just a couple of examples of this. This is an image on the left with those purple lines that I like, that comes out of Virginia from a nonprofit there called the Virginia Public Access Project, which tracks campaign finance. And it's a graph on the left side. It shows kind of how much a number of companies and trade associations and other interests spent on politics in 2018. And then on the right side, how much in 2020. A lot of spending actually went down for reasons related to COVID. What's most interesting to me about this chart is who's not on the graph, which is Dominion Energy, the biggest electric utility and also a gas utility based in Virginia. It's not on the graph because it gave so much money in 2020 that if they were on that graph, it would compress the scale so much as to make everything else useless. They gave about a little shy of $250,000 to political campaigns and legislators in 2020. And that's often the case. Utilities are quite often either the top spender or among the top 2 or 3 spenders, along with maybe, an insurance company or a mining company, depending on the dominant interest in a state, within a state's politics. On the right, this is just a graph from one of the pages on our site about how much utilities in Ohio gave to the campaign of Governor Mike DeWine in 2018. This happens with both parties. Utilities give money to Democrats and Republicans. In the last couple of decades, the money has tended to go more toward Republicans, but certainly not exclusively. And in lots of states, utilities give lots of money to both sides of the aisle. And obviously that's really important because legislators write laws that affect utilities. Governors appoint the regulators on the public utility commissions or public service commissions that Leah mentioned, that directly regulate utilities' profits and how much solar we have and whether they are allowed to build gas plants and all that kind of stuff. A few states actually directly elect their regulators, like Arizona, which Leah mentioned. And in some cases, utilities are able to give money directly to the campaigns of their regulators. But most people know about that. What is less known, but certainly in the news in sort of utility land a lot lately, is dark money. So dark money is kind of a euphemism. It doesn't have a great single definition, but the way that term is commonly used is to refer to organizations that don't have to disclose their donors and that their donors don't have to disclose giving them money. So these are often called 501c4 organizations because it's a part of the tax code they're organized under. But it basically allows companies to give lots of money secretly to organizations that then use that money to try to influence politics. So a couple of pictures here from Ohio, where this issue has been probably the most prevalent recently. Basically what happened is First Energy, large utility company that operates in Ohio, also a bunch of other states that I think what I could see from the chat before, we have some folks on this call from some of them. So places like Maryland, New Jersey, West Virginia, all have First Energy subsidiaries operating there. What First Energy did was they gave $60 million to this man with the mask pictured on the left. His name is Larry Householder. Not for him sort of, personally, although he did keep a little bit of that money for himself, but to run basically a massive slush fund that he distributed out to other people running for the legislature in Ohio. He used the power that came with that money to get himself elected to Speaker of the House of Representatives in Ohio, a really powerful position. And then in exchange, he helped ram through a law that First Energy had been trying to pass some version of for years, either through the Trump administration or in Ohio, that ended the renewable energy and energy efficiency standards in Ohio and also bailed out First Energy's coal and nuclear plants of its merchant subsidiary. Then when environmental advocates tried to overturn that law, which is called HB 6, First Energy spent tens of millions more dollars on a campaign to stop that effort, which was a ballot initiative effort. So that picture on the right is this sort of racist propaganda that First Energy was bankrolling to try to stop that ballot initiative to overturn that law. And those dark money examples are not limited to Ohio. We know that utilities in Michigan, Arizona, states in the Southeast have all spent money this way, sort of money that's designed to be untrackable. Folks in the chat were talking about net metering policies, and Leah was talking about the battle over net metering. We've seen dark money show up in those battles in places like Iowa. So this is a very prevalent issue with utilities. Probably even lesser known is how utilities spend money, spend charitable money to influence politics. And so, at first glance, these big multi-billion-dollar companies giving money to charity sounds like a good thing, right? I mean, in theory, we want that, companies and individuals and everybody giving money to good causes. And it can be a perfectly fine and even good thing for utilities to do. The problem comes in where they are trying to exploit that charitable giving toward political ends, and often the money they give comes with strings attached. So, there's this term that is very relevant to utilities called regulatory capture, where they sort of, through a combination of political influence and sort of just overwhelming regulators, utilities are able to get what they want out of regulators. I think of this as a sort of civil society capture, where utilities are able to take, a lot of the local organizations that might otherwise be standing up against them on issues like rate increases or electricity shutoffs, which Chandra might talk a little bit more about. And, they're donating to them to sort of buy their support. And we've seen it play out that way, where local organizations or even national organizations who take money from charitable donations from utilities, will show up at the PUC and offer testimony or public comment supporting the utility's position on issues. So it's definitely something to watch out for. It's not an indictment of those groups. Those are often small charities that have good causes and are just trying to, raise money in perfectly understandable ways. But I do think it's really cynical tactic by utilities to try to buy support or at least silence from a lot of groups that might otherwise oppose their agenda. And then the last one I'll talk about that's really important is trade associations. So Electric utilities and gas utilities have big trade associations that they're a part of that carry a lot of their political water, particularly in Washington, D.C. For electric utilities, their big trade association is called the Edison Electric Institute. For gas utilities, it's called the American Gas Association. They're also members of other large trade associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce often, or the Nuclear Energy Institute. And those organizations are pretty inherently political. Most of their work is around trying to push or block policies, EEI, lobbies, the EPA around the regulations it's going to release around clean air and clean water. They lobby Congress. They'll certainly be lobbying Congress, and already are, around the clean energy standard policy that Leah mentioned. And that's fine. That's what trade associations do. One of the problems we've tried to point out with this is that they're doing that with our money. Essentially, as utility customers, we are subsidizing these activities. So what happens is a large utility, say, Florida Power and Light in Florida, they pay their dues to the Edison Electric Institute every year of a couple $1 million. Then the next time they have a rate case in Florida, they ask regulators to give them permission to recover that $2 million out of our bills. And historically, they've always gotten that permission. So it's a big problem because, unfortunately, it's not a lot of money per customer, but it adds up a lot. And we really have no say over the matter. Some fraction of, a couple pennies on our bill every month is going to pay for these lobbying efforts, against rooftop solar, against good climate policies in many cases. So that's kind of the trade association element of it. And the last thing I'll just talk about very briefly before I look forward to hearing what Chandra has to say and all your questions is, I just want to talk about how we can fight back against these issues. So in addition to, the fights that many of us are engaged in around issues like rooftop solar, around clean energy policies, shutting down coal plants, making sure that our utilities are keeping people's rates just, particularly for low-income customers, and not cutting off power for people who are a few dollars short on their bills. There are ways to fight against this larger influence machine, and people have done that really effectively. So I've just got 3 suggestions here. The first is to organize. This is, echoes some advice that Leah gave. These are really big, powerful companies. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to sort of force change on them as one person, but that's why we have great organizations like Solar United Neighbors that's working in many states around the country and nationally. Organizations like Partnership for Southern Equity, which is working to stand up for customers and communities against utilities. So, if you're on this call, you're probably affiliated at least with Solar United Neighbors and possibly other organizations. And I just urge folks to get involved as much as they can with those groups, because that's the way we can sort of, pool our resources to go up against these guys. And a few specific things that we could do around this influence. While probably, I don't think campaign finance reform, or at least comprehensive campaign finance reform is on the horizon tomorrow, at least federally or in most states. We certainly can ask politicians not to take money from monopoly utilities. There's no rule saying they have to accept it. And that has been a really effective organizing tactic in a lot of places. The picture there is of a great activist in Arizona named Stacey Champion, who has been calling on legislators in Arizona and regulators not to take any money from Arizona Public Service. We've seen this tactic used really effectively in Virginia, where there's been a pledge asking people running for office at any level, from Congress to the state house or governor, not to accept money from Dominion or Appalachian Power, any other monopoly utilities. So that's been really powerful. Even the act of asking communicates something to these politicians that, these monopoly utilities are a problem in our politics, and you shouldn't be swayed by their money. And then the other thing speaks to that last bit I mentioned about trade associations, but also more broadly, regulators are supposed to, as a general principle in almost all states, not let utilities use our money that they collect from us in our bills every month against us to advocate politically. Utilities might say it's in our interest, the political advocacy they're doing. That's fine, but we should be able to decide that for ourselves, right? So, there are ways, both in established proceedings like rate cases, but also more broadly for, groups and individuals to say to our public utility commissions, hey, we don't want our money going toward these political expenses that utilities are making. If they are going to spend on politics, they should have to do that with their profits, which are handsome. There's a whole opportunity and a large thread of work there that I think organizations can take on at the state level to prevent utilities from using our money toward these political influence machines that they have built. And I will stop there and pass the mic back to Glenn and look forward to all your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. I have a question to ask you about how do we exactly stop utilities from using our money against us? And so I'm going to talk to you about some specific policies that may be out there. So we'll get to that during the Q&A. Our last speaker is Chandra Farley. Chandra serves as the Just Energy Director at the Partnership for Southern Equity, where she leads a team of staff and organizers to develop strategies to advance energy equity through coalition building, leadership development, community organizing, and leveraging data and research. Chandra is a graduate of the EPA's Environmental Justice Academy, co-chair of the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice Advisory Board, and she serves on the board of directors for several community and advocacy organizations in Georgia, where she is based. So with that, Chandra Farley. Chandra, I think,
Thanks so much, Glenn. Yeah. So I have been continuing to try to figure out my dual screen and screen sharing. So I believe that we are all set now. And
no.
I am super excited to be here with
Hey,
Dr.
Chandra, excuse me just a second. I think you need to, what we're seeing is not the full screen of your slides.
I think she just has to hit start slideshow now. Do you want to try hitting that one?
Try that. I mean, we can see it, but it's very small because it's not your full. There you go.
Perfect.
Hey, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. So thanks so much, Glenn and Liz and Solar United Neighbors. I'm super excited to be here with David and Dr. Leah Stokes. So the setup has been perfect, right? What do we do about these things? So I will talk about who Partnership for Southern Equity is and how we shape our work around this issue of utility accountability. So just for folks, Partnership for Southern Equity, we are a racial equity organization. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia, working across the American South at the intersection of racial equity and energy and climate, which is the just energy work that I lead, equitable development, economic inclusion, and health equity. And I always say to folks that our logo is a circle for a reason. All of these issue areas are interconnected, and these are the 4 key areas that we believe that we have the most opportunity to flip these historical inequities embedded in equitable systems like our energy systems to a forward-thinking, more just and equitable future. And one of the key things I think that I'd like to get started talking about is, you know, why is this important? And one of those opportunities is the way we do our work. And our work at Partnership for Southern Equity is all about systems transformation, right? And so when we're talking about something like an energy or utility system, and we're based in Atlanta, you know, headquarters of Southern Company and Georgia Power, we're really talking about a people's transformation. And we do that through 5 core strategies. So we focus on coalition building, leadership development, community organizing, leveraging data and research, and also authentic community engagement. And that is really important because these are all of the areas that we focus on to develop what we refer to as the equity ecosystem, if you will. And the equity ecosystem is about bringing together all of the different actors that you need to really focus on advancing, envisioning, and pulling together more just and equitable policy. And for Just Energy team, that is really about more equitable and just energy policy, utility policies and programs, and at the city level, at the utility level, at the state level, across the board. So why just energy? Why is that important? And what do we mean by that? Well, when we talk about just energy, we are really talking about the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens from energy production and consumption. And I think we can listen, we can harken back to everything that Dr. Leah Stokes said and David talked to us about, but we can look at any equity indicator that you would like to look at. And particularly now, as we are still in the midst of a raging global pandemic with COVID, what that did was really exacerbate and amplify all of the inequities that we talk so much about, and really has its foundations in the gross inequities and injustices related to our energy and utility programs and policy. So when we talk about why is racial equity in energy top of mind? Well, we can look at things like energy burden. Energy burden has become a really top priority, top point of conversation around energy and utilities, particularly when we are talking about community. And one of the reasons I think that is really important, someone who comes from, a technical, sort of background working on energy, water, resource efficiency programs on buildings, but it's a similar conversation when talking to people. Why don't nonprofits have more money to put in programs and services? Why don't nonprofits and buildings have more money to put on the ground with the people they're served? Well, their operations are out of control. And what is included in operations? Utility costs. And what happens with nonprofits like the communities that they serve? They are resource strapped, they are under-resourced, and they're marginalized, right? Because they're in the people service business. And so this is one of the ways that we have really been able to appeal to what is important about advancing racial equity in energy, is that people education, building power with communities, and really serving. I really see ourselves and our organizers and our partners serving as technical assistance resources, right? So communities can speak for themselves, right? Communities inherently have power. What we are able to do as a community-based movement organization is to step in and fill those capacity gaps. So when we're talking about energy burden and the opportunity to
Chandra, a couple people were asking if there were other slides. You may just be wanting to show the mission of PSE, and that's fine. I just wanted to check in and see if there were other slides because a couple people asked questions about that.
Thank you. So I just have a couple, but for whatever reason, it's pausing my screen share. So thanks for the heads up.
Okay, sorry. Great.
Yep, definitely. And I will, I'll try a new share, and if that doesn't work, we'll just skip it, right?
Okay, we can see it now. It's not like full screen, but we can almost see it full screen.
Okay, yeah, no worries. I'll just stop and talk. So, so again, when we're talking about getting back to racial equity in energy and building power with communities, how do we make this real to people? And how do we talk to people about why is this important? Why don't you have a choice? Why is it important that you have a choice in your utility provider or the types of programs that your utilities are putting out? And when we think about this, what we have to remember is that sometimes the only interaction that the majority of people who aren't practitioners, who aren't advocates in this space, may have with their utility is getting their bill. And quite frankly, are you really thinking about your bill? Not really, unless you can't pay it, right? And then it becomes an issue that you've got to talk to your community about, or you've got to get help from your community center, if that might be your church. So this is why I think the energy burden issue was really an important elevation around this data and around these disparities, because it was really an ignition point for people to understand why this was such a critical issue. And so again, when we're talking about inequities and how do people make this real to themselves, how do people make this real to their communities? Well, we can talk about, I'll use Atlanta as an example, but Atlanta is really, as a city that is just barely almost majority Black, the metro region of Atlanta is definitely majority people of color. But when we are looking at, we can look at disparities like the median energy burden for households that are considered low income are almost 4 times that of higher income households. Also, the energy burden on renters, who, when you break down the demographics of renters, you are once again talking about households that are Black households, Latino households, people of color, or low income households. And sometimes this is really what you need to make a connection with people. You know, folks aren't worried about not paying their energy bill on Monday, not being able to pay a hospital bill on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday worried about losing their job because their child has an asthma attack and they don't have sick days on Wednesday. All of these things are happening on top of folks all the time. So that is why our strategies around utility accountability are so important. So through our coalitions, we have the technical assistance people, the policy professionals around the table with neighborhood-based organizations, faith-based organizations, academia, all working together in different committees. We have a policy and advocacy committee, an education and action committee, and an Energize and Connect committee, which is kind of the organizing arm. So let's take, for instance, our integrated resource plan process that Leah talked about, explaining our investor-owned utilities for us in Georgia, that is Georgia Power. Every 3 years, they have to come in front of the Public Service Commission and present their update to a 20-year long-range plan for the utilities. This has traditionally been a process that is exclusive, presents many barriers to communities being able to come in and speak directly to their commissioners about the real impact of utility decisions on their households and household economic stability, quite frankly. So that process is a 6-month-long process, and then it is followed by, you know, some folks in the chat have been talking about rate cases. So there's a 6-month process around this long range, you know, integrated resource plan, and then there's this rate case. So how do you make sense of that for a community? Well, quite frankly, you know, as I stated, number one, the energy bill utility burden issue has been critical to connecting with communities to get engaged in these utility processes. And then the rate case really becomes another opportunity to demonstrate for community, this is how this regulatory statewide body is making decisions that, even more so than sometimes the legislature, particularly here in Georgia, is making decisions every single day that direct you and your household and your community directly. So being able to do that 101 level education, you know, we talk about what an electric membership cooperative is, what a municipal utility is, and what the IOU is, you know, for us here in Georgia Power. And then it's like, well, what do I do? And so we talk to folks like, well, number one, the Public Service Commission is located at 244 Washington Street in downtown Atlanta, And pre-COVID, you can go down there at any time and you can talk to your commissioner. Here's their phone number. Here is their email. Get in touch with them. Make sure they know who you are, because they are quick to say that, oh, well, we haven't heard from anyone, or, you know, we don't get those calls. And what we know for sure is in that 2019 process that we have been able to continue building on is that people are paying attention. And so we were able to mobilize, you know, a couple of hundred people, to some who for the first time ever came to Atlanta to testify and offer public comment in front of the Public Service Commission. Some for the first time who had never heard of the Public Service Commission, who didn't know where this office is, who didn't know what this process was, and were able to come together through making public comment, demonstrating outside of the Public Service Commission. And then I think, you know, we'll get to in the Q&A, what that has led us to is particularly through the COVID pandemic, and talking about our just energy objectives, which include Public Service Commission intervention, democratizing rural electric cooperatives. And that leads us to the federal advocacy around the no shutoffs and the call for a national moratorium on utility shutoffs. So getting people engaged in these ways, quite frankly, to agitate, right? Getting in good trouble, like being the good agitator and pulling these issues out that are connecting with people on a home level, on a personal level, because these systems are 100 years old. These regulatory bodies are set up specifically to create barriers for people. So it's really all about appealing to our shared values as a community, and also creating a shared vision for what a more just and equitable energy future looks like. And that includes prioritizing partnerships with community-based organizations and training resident leaders, and elevating the importance of and pathways to community ownerships of renewable energy systems, which we know has the ability to deliver the racial equity promises that are embedded in a just transformation to a clean energy economy. And so I'll stop there.
And thank you very much, Chandra. Collectively, the speakers have given us a lot to chew on. I thought I would start off the questions, and I wanted to ask Leah if she maybe could talk about or cite some specific utility, victories over utilities in the history. I know you do talk about some of this in your book. And how did these wins come about? What were the key elements to make this, to hold these utilities accountable in these particular cases?
Sure. So as part of my book, I did a lot of work on California. And one of the things that really stood out for why California ratcheted up its renewable portfolio standard to the point where it's now at a 100% clean electricity standard is that it has an intervenor compensation program. And if you haven't heard of this before, it's a policy that only exists in a couple states. And it's exactly the kind of thing that pushing for in more states, I'd really like one in Georgia right about now, could make such a big difference. Because what does it do? It basically, if a utility wants to intervene in a public utility rate case or IRP proceeding or all this stuff that we've been talking about, you know how they can afford to do that? They can charge customers for all their time. If they send a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of utility people, we all pick up the bill for that. So they have, in some sense, unlimited spending when it comes to PUC rate cases. Now, what about all of us? What about the public? What about equity advocates or consumer advocates, environmental advocates? How do we get funding? Well, we don't have an unlimited pool of money to go and intervene in these proceedings. And so we have a fundamental asymmetry. Well, in California, they have a program called the Intervenor Compensation Program. It was established in the early 80s. And what it does is it says, much like a utility can get paid for its costs to intervene, public advocates can also get paid for their costs to intervene. And there's actually been an independent analysis of this program, and it's found that it's saved, 15 times, not quite, I think it's 14 times, I'm slightly exaggerating, 14 times as much money as it costs in terms of reduced rates. So that's not even, of course, adding in all the benefits when it comes to air quality, people's health bills, climate stability, equity and justice, right? We have so many other benefits from this system too. So I really think that pushing for intervenor compensation programs is a way that we can get more of these utility wins. And an exciting thing is that in the omnibus bill that passed Congress at the end of the year, there was a redirective to FERC, which is like our federal PUC basically, that they are supposed to set up an Office of Public Participation, which would include an intervenor compensation program at the federal level. So Public Citizen actually has been doing a lot of work on this. If people are interested in intervenor compensation programs, I write about it a little bit in my book, but I think that's a way that we can get more wins. And then another interesting win is something that David Pomerantz brought up, which is in Virginia. These advocates organized very effectively to get politicians to stop taking money from Dominion. And that really changed the politics in the subsequent legislative session, because these legislators were no longer beholden to the utility. So I think breaking that relationship between especially Democratic politicians and utilities is really crucial to trying to break the monopoly power that utilities often have over not just PUCs, but also state legislatures. And so campaigns to get utility money out of politics, I think, are another kind of model that we can build on.
Thanks, Leah. That's really interesting. That's very helpful. It's a very concrete path forward. Here's a question for David Pomerantz. So you had mentioned in your last slide about the policies that could hold utilities accountable. In effect, you've put your finger on a key thing. Leah's just mentioned it as well. The utilities have unlimited funds, and that those funds come from ratepayers, from in some places taxpayers. So what are the kind of model policies that are around there that could be implemented to stop this practice of using our money against us?
There are some. I talked a little bit about how utilities kind of take our money and ship it off to trade associations, which do a lot of lobbying and political work. There are, without new laws, there are sort of administrative actions that public utility commissions can take to ban that practice. New laws can help clarify that, order PUCs to do that. So New Hampshire passed a law not too long ago, making it illegal for utilities to charge ratepayers for their trade association dues if the trade associations are working on political advocacy. So there are some models like that. Laws have been proposed but not passed to ban legislators from accepting money from monopoly utilities. I think those would probably run into some pretty big legal challenges, but they're worth exploring, certainly. I think even without new laws, there's just a lot that commissions can do to sort of force this issue. So, when Arizona Public Service's spending on dark money groups to elect their own regulators became really, really toxic, the commissioners there, a bipartisan commission of Republicans and Democrats, I think felt pressured and compelled enough that they had to do something about that, where it took them many years of pushing, and embroiled in court cases with the utility, but they did ultimately force the utility to disclose, all of its charitable spending, all of its trade association spending, all of its spending on politics, all that dark money C4 spending that we weren't able to see before. They forced them to disclose all that, and that really did have an impact. It didn't ban many of those kinds of giving; it just forced disclosure. But there's a reason utilities want to do this stuff in the dark of night. It makes people furious. It risks their political standing. And they're not invulnerable. They're subject to public sentiment. If everybody gets really, really mad at a utility, that is a big problem for them. So even these disclosure solutions can be really powerful. And you saw that happen in Arizona, around the time that the Public Utilities Commission forced those disclosures, Arizona Public Service, their longtime CEO, who was sort of the leader of all of these efforts, he, either quit or was fired. It kind of, we'll probably never quite know exactly how that happened, but the company got a new CEO who has pledged that they would no longer spend money on electing their regulators. And so, even without sort of brand new campaign finance laws or constructs, you can see this start to change. I mean, just to speak about Georgia briefly, since Chandra talked so much about the work there, Georgia Power and other subsidiaries of Southern Company have spent a lot of money on the election of the regulators for the Georgia Public Service Commission. And when that has been, exposed and in the newspapers and on the radio and people talking about it, you'll see the public service commissioners start to try to distance themselves from Georgia Power a little bit because they don't want to be perceived as corrupt. I think that hasn't happened enough, but just sort of raising awareness about this can be pretty powerful and have a little bit of an inoculating effect against the utilities' political power. It's probably not enough on its own. It needs to be part of a suite of solutions. I think intervener funding, like Leah mentioned, is an important way to level the playing field. And there are a lot of other things that we can do. But sort of raising those issues and bringing them out of the sort of, corners and into the center of attention can be really helpful.
I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to just say that one thing I have not mentioned is that, with the Sierra Club, 2 weeks ago, I put out a big report called Dirty Utilities, and we looked at the top 50 dirtiest utilities. Georgia Power makes the list, along with Southern. And we actually have a dashboard where you can look up these utilities and in a one-stop shopping way, figure out what are their plans for retiring coal, what are their plans for building new gas, what are their plans for building renewables. Because as Chandra was telling us, these things are so all over the place in these IRP proceedings, they're hard to access. And so we tried to put it all together in one place. And I would just encourage people to check out that dashboard and maybe use it in some of their local work on this issue.
Great, thank you. There's a question from one of the participants about community choice aggregation and specifically community. So the question really is, does community choice aggregation really, is this a policy that can make a meaningful difference on the issue that we're talking about? I'll offer that to anyone who wants to tackle it.
I have opinions about this, but I know Chandra hasn't had a chance to talk during the Q&A, so I wanted to see if she wanted to add anything first.
Thanks, Leah. I would love to be able to talk about CCA, and that is something that we definitely look at. So I will pass on those who are, who have more experience with that.
Well, I have a little bit of a controversial take. I think that there's a lot of good things about CCAs. What can it do? It can do a lot of the organizing work in a community, help people meet one another, help people understand the utility problem and get concrete about it and really build that local political power that's so critical. I think that's a lot of the good things. It also freaks utilities out. And maybe gets them acting a little bit faster because they're freaked out by all these community choice programs. You've seen this in California for sure. But in terms of really dramatically transforming the electricity system, I think there's real limits, because what we do need to do is steer these Goliaths, these utilities, in the right direction. And so what I think it does is it creates an incentive for utilities to feel threatened and to say, okay, we're actually going to do something. And Santa Barbara actually just recently did this too, set up a CCA program. But because of a lot of these CCAs involve buying sort of unbundled RECs, you're not necessarily bringing in new built stuff to a community. And I think the gold standard that we should be shooting for in CCA programs as they move forward is to make sure that we're actually building new stuff in the community or in the area and really delivering that, and not just sort of buying credits for clean power that's elsewhere.
Anyone else want to comment on community choice aggregation? Okay. This is a question for Chandra. So based on your experience with these specific on the ground campaigns, like the ones you referred to, for example, before the PSC there in Georgia, what were the lessons learned? How can we learn from your experience, your mistakes. You talk really eloquently about community organizing, the power of that. But I'm wondering what are the lessons learned?
The number one lesson learned is that this is a long game. When we are talking about transforming energy systems, transforming utility programs and policies, these are like tackling climate change. These are long-term generational issues. And when you are working with community, and particularly at Partnership for Southern Equity, when we talk about grassroots organizing, we are talking about values-based organizing. And that is really something that our founder and chief equity officer has really coined. So when we're bringing people together or being invited into community, we don't parachute into community and go, we're invited in by partners, right? And what we understand is that sometimes the issue may not be energy, right? We may partner with an organization and come in and introduce ourselves as Partnership for Southern Equity and talk about our issue areas. And we want to be there to listen and hear from the community what their priorities are and what the pain points are. And we are very clear that sometimes it may not be about their utility bill. It may not be, what's happening with their EMC. And because of this equity ecosystem and our partnerships that we focus on building, that's how I met Liz, through our regional coalition that focuses on democratizing electric membership cooperatives. What we understand is that this is a long game. It's about building relationships. And let's say folks had a question about economic development, or, it could be anything. We have a large group of partners and folks and resources that we can connect them with. So when January 22 does roll around, or, October 22 does roll around, we say, hey, we go back, hey, there's this thing happening at the Public Service Commission, and we really, are trying to build a group of people to come together and speak out about this. Can we come and talk to you about it? Then they know us. We are in partnership. We have already built a relationship together, and it makes it a lighter lift, if you will, to bring in these really heavy, gnarly, super technical, technocratic, kinds of issues. So you really just have to be prepared to be there for the long game, and be there to be in partnership in building community for these visions that we are trying to achieve.
Thanks for that answer. Here's a question that really all of you might want to comment on. This is a question from Alice Madden from Community Powered, Minnesota. She says, would you recommend an election-based process for commissioners? I think she's referring to public utility commissioners or public service commissioners, or an appointment-based process to ensure greater accountability to communities. And so this is actually a great question, because Georgia has an elected PSC. I know, Leah, you've written about Arizona, which is the other very famous one that's always embroiled in controversies. And David, you track this stuff all the time. So what do you think about this? I mean, I'm sure there's a variation of choose your poison, but what do you think?
I'll take a quick stab, and then I'm curious to hear what Chandra and Leah think. I am agnostic on this question. So I have seen appointed commissions do a pretty good job standing up for the public interest and an awful job. And I've seen elected commissions do a pretty good job and an awful job. Unfortunately, utilities are incredibly creative about how they deploy influence and capture these commissions. So I get this question all the time because we track this in a bunch of places, and often it's kind of a loaded question where people who are very frustrated dealing with an elected commission tell me, what we've got to do is appoint the commission, like have the governor make the appointment. That will make things better. And I've seen people with appointed commissions saying, oh my gosh, this is so hard. There's no accountability. We want to elect these people through direct democracy, and that will make things better. And I kind of want them all to talk to each other and realize that it's all subject to going poorly. And so the way I look at it is like, it's not really the, whether it's elected or appointed isn't as important as how much is the public able to hold that commission accountable? And you can do that in either case, right? With an appointed commission, you know, you can hold the commission accountable through the normal processes of public comments and testimony and intervention, and also by, if the commission's doing a terrible job representing customers in the public interest and community's well-being, you know, that can become a political problem for a governor who has to appoint new commissioners. And we've seen that happen in some cases. Same thing with elections, right? But short version is, you know, unfortunately, utilities have very sophisticated ways of gaming both systems. So we as advocates for our communities need to be similarly sophisticated in representing people's interests in both systems. And I would say, I haven't seen an empirical difference in one being sort of better or worse than the other. It's all a question of how much we're able to hold those public officials accountable to the public interest rather than corporate interests.
Thanks. Chandra, what do you think? You have an elected, you're battling the elected PSC there all the time. Would you really prefer it to be appointed by the governor?
No, I really appreciate David's analysis. And I think what I will say is interesting about Georgia's Public Service Commission, it is an elected body, but the majority of our commissioners were first appointed by the governor because they used very sophisticated, timely tactics around maintaining control. So we have had situations where certain commissioners will resign after election day, which allows the governor to appoint them. And, you know, so it's like, and then they get to run as an incumbent, right? So then when you're thinking about an office like the Public Service Commission, which it breaks my heart every election for reporters to interview people standing in line, because we had a third Democrat on the ballot in that January election. He could have been the first Democrat elected to statewide office in Georgia in 2 decades. And there were still people standing in line on election day who had never heard of the Public Service Commission. So that power of then being appointed by the governor and then getting to run as an incumbent is very powerful when people go to the ballot box and there's an office that they don't know anything about, so that you see incumbent and it's like, oh, well, this guy has already done it before, let me just vote for him, or they don't vote at all, right? So to David's point, it's all about building community awareness and people power to have those chops and first person advocacy to hold them accountable either way.
Leah, do you want to add anything from a historical perspective here?
I mean, I just agree with what both the other panelists have said. It's half a dozen, one terrible to the other. And I love that Georgia example. There you go. You can even game it if it's elected and make it appointed. And it's a big issue.
Right. A lot of people asked questions about the cost shift argument, the so-called cost shift myth. And this is that claim that utilities, Leah referred to it specifically, but the claim that distributed solar, rooftop solar in particular, is somehow being subsidized by other ratepayers, and it's a giveaway to people who can afford it from people who can't afford it, all of those kinds of claims. And I think, we had several questions that touch on this. This is the central argument that the utilities are making against rooftop solar and also community solar. So I thought I'd throw it to the panelists, because this is very much a part of holding them accountable, is holding them accountable to this false myth.
Yeah, I mean, so the basic argument that's been made for a long time is that you know, when you, it's the fixed cost problem that I was talking about at the beginning, that when you put solar on your roof and you're paid the retail rate, then you're not really paying for your fair share of the grid. But of course, you're also not being paid for all the benefits that you are providing, right? Like cleaner air, for example, more local stability to the grid because you're feeding into the distribution system too, right? So there are actually benefits as well, and neither the costs or the benefits are really being weighed. And when we have had efforts to do that through, for example, value of solar tariffs, those are also very politically vulnerable, just like anything else. And so when you want to estimate like what's the cost or the benefit of doing all these things, we have to recognize that those models are being built within a political context where utilities have money to lose and where solar companies have money to make, and the customers are sort of stuck in between those two things. And you know, we never have paid for the full true cost of pollution, and therefore we've never really valued solar fairly. So personally, there are some economists and others who worry a lot about this cost shift and worry a lot about you know, net metering being unfair. But how come those economists aren't writing papers about how we put a cost shift by sticking fossil fuel plants in Black, Indigenous, and Latinx backyards for decades on end? And we literally caused communities to have massive health bills, you know, have Black children having asthma rates 2 times as high as white children. I mean, where's the cost shift study there, you know? So I think it's a very unfair analysis that is only coming at the last. It's kind of like the icing of the electricity system, right? They're like worried about equity at this level. They're not worried about equity at the whole of system level. And if we were worried about equity in an inclusive way, then we wouldn't be building these fossil fuel plants, because we wouldn't have anywhere to put them, because we wouldn't be able to outsource them to communities of color, which is what we've been doing for decades. So I don't know, that's my general take on the cost shift argument, but it's very easy to get worked up, I suppose, about some of these marginal changes in the electricity system. And I would also point out, how come industrial users who free ride in all these different ways get to pay really low rates, and we're not worried about a cost shift there? We're saying, oh, it makes sense for industrial users to have lower electricity rates and low fixed costs. You know, so this system is not some perfectly equitably balanced system. That is just BS, as I would say. And to try to put all this on the solar at the end of the day through this cost shift argument is very political, in my view.
Yep. David or Chandra, you want to add anything to that on the cost shift argument by these utilities?
I mean, Leah just made so many important points, hard to add to. I'll just say, particularly on this point, that utilities have, you know, really honed. There is a very pernicious element of the argument that they make that, you know, because of this alleged cost shift, you know, rooftop solar is like not only a subsidy, but it's worse for lower income customers than wealthier customers, because like any emerging technology, the early days of rooftop solar have tended to be adopted more by people who can afford it, right? And that's real. We shouldn't paper that over. You know, I think the solution to that is to make rooftop solar more accessible to everybody, not to make it harder for everyone, which is kind of the utility solution. The other thing I'll just add in terms of, you know, to me, the glaring hypocrisy of that sort of class-based and often race-based argument that utilities make that I think is really disingenuous is these are not companies that have done well by their poorest customers, right? And that's empirically true if you look at much bigger issues, frankly, for their customer base and rooftop solar. So I'm really glad Chandra talked before about the campaign that Partnership for Southern Equity is one of the leaders on, which is to make it illegal for utilities to shut off electricity for people who are late on their bills, which is a pervasive problem. There was a big study that just came out that said, you know, tangibly you can show actually that because of these utility shutoffs during the pandemic, it actually, you know, significantly increased COVID cases and deaths, because, you know, people who, you know, had to worry about, are they going to pay their medicine bill or their electric utility bill? And does that force them out of the house to continue working? You know, all these different knock-on effects of the energy burden and injustice baked into the system that really hurts the poorest among us. And, just as an example, the CEO of Southern Company, which is the utility holding company that owns, or the utility company that owns Georgia Power, he was the highest paid executive in the industry in 2019. If he took home $28 million of compensation in 2019, he could have taken, just a 30% pay cut, still leaving him with $20 million instead of $30 million. And that would have wiped out the arrearages, the debt of every single Georgia Power customer that was 3 months late on their bills at the end of last summer. So, where's the conversation about the inequities of that cost shift, right? The cost shift of customers, paying tens of millions of dollars in executive salary. So I just don't think, frankly, like the argument is on the level. If utilities are concerned about cost shifts, if they're concerned about their poorest customers, there's a hell of a lot that they can be doing to better serve those customers and protect them that they're not doing right now.
Thanks. Chandra, do you want to add anything on that? I was going to reference that great report by the NAACP that was highlighted in a New York Times article not too long ago. And I think David might have been quoted in that piece as well, that pushes back against these claims. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about it through an equity lens.
Well, I think Leah and David covered it. If we're going to have the conversation, let's have the whole conversation. Utilities are masters at crafting the conversation to their benefit, right? And these are huge monopolies, and let's have the conversation about racial capitalism and the white supremacy embedded in these systems from their very creation, and why it is critical that we continue to build up these movements to topple them. Quite frankly, why are we subsidizing Tom Fanning's, salary, or, Paul Bauer's, salary? Why, in the middle of a global pandemic, in the hottest July on record ever, would you resume shutoffs on people, including your most vulnerable populations? Why, in the middle of a global pandemic, is your first month of shutoffs 25% higher than it was in the same month the year before? Why, in the middle of a global pandemic, would the Public Service Commission approve, on top of the billions of dollars of rate increases that were just approved by a Public Service Commission in December 2019, why then, just not 6 months later, would this body see fit to approve another $7.7 billion of COVID costs for the utility that ratepayers have to pay for, but then you're shutting them up? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, and the cost shifting, some of these conversations, fuzzy math, right? Fuzzy math to the benefit of not the people, is the simplest way.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap things up, and we have one slide here that, Annie, if you could just add that last slide from the few slides that we have. There it is. So I wanted to just mention a really easy action that everyone can take here. This is something that David mentioned about urging candidates to stop taking utility campaign donations. And he mentioned, of course, there's a number of efforts. I just wanted to talk about the one that we have on our website. And we'll send the link out when we send out the information on the webinar. We'll set this direct link so you don't have to take notes or anything. But basically, this is an easy way to tell elected officials, both state and federal, that it's completely wrong to take money from these utilities that they, of course, are supposed to hold accountable. And so there's a pledge here, and it's an easy thing to do. It's an easy thing to share. And as David said, it's important that they hear from people, that we try to stigmatize this sort of behavior. And it's something we all can do. So I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that there's a practical and meaningful action without exaggerating, where it'll go. We're finding it a really useful thing to do. You can also adapt something like this for a state campaign. Famously, the Virginia one was pretty successful. Of course, that hasn't changed Dominion, the utility there, from doing what they're doing, but it actually has changed the behavior of a number of elected officials. So I mentioned that here before wrapping up. It's an important action to take because we can get overwhelmed with the bad news here, and it's important to think about the actions that we can take. I also want to, next slide, please, Annie. Just let you know that you can learn more at our website. Of course, I encourage you to go to the Partnership for Southern Equity website, as well as EPI's website, for lots of good resources. Recommend that you check out of the library or buy Dr. Leah Stokes' great book. I have a copy of it. I have read 3/4 of it, and it is just great, and I intend to finish it. But you can also contact us directly at Solar United Neighbors by sending an email at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. And so with that, I just want to thank the panelists for doing such a great job. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It was a really stimulating discussion and really important one. I also want to thank my colleagues, Lynn Veazey and Annie Wolf, for helping out, answering all the questions in the chat. And just want to remind all the participants that we'll be sending up a follow email to everyone who registered, including the people who registered that didn't show. But we had a great attendance for this, really encouraging. And we'll send out the link to the recorded webinar and a couple of other related links. So with that, I'll just wrap it up, and thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon. Bye.